The glass shattered at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and when the smoke cleared, the only person standing between a dying mob patriarch and a second bullet was a 23-year-old cocktail waitress named Sloan Wilder, who had nothing in her purse but a cracked phone, $42 in tips, and an unpaid electric bill back in her studio apartment on the south side of New Orleans. By the time the paramedics arrived, Salvatore Mancini, the 68-year-old iron fist behind the Gulf Coast's most feared crime syndicate, was alive, unharmed, and already reaching for his phone to call his son. And his son, Dominic Mancini, made one decision that night that would change both their lives forever. He claimed her. New Orleans in October felt like the city was trying to sweat out a fever it had been running for 300 years. The humidity sat thick and low even after midnight, and the neon signs along Bourbon Street bled their colors into every puddle on the sidewalk. The Velvet Room was not technically on Bourbon Street. It was one block east, tucked between a shuttered dry cleaner and a parking garage, which was exactly why the right people knew about it, and everyone else didn't. Sloan Wilder had been working the floor at the Velvet Room for 11 months. Before that, it had been a hospital cafeteria, which paid even less and smelled considerably worse. She was working her way through the last 18 credits of a nursing degree she had started 3 years ago, paused twice, and was determined to finish by the time she turned 25, though the math was getting harder to square every semester. Her father had died the previous January, leaving behind a modest house in Metairie, with a second mortgage Sloan hadn't known about and a stack of medical bills she was still wading through. She didn't complain about any of it. That wasn't her way. She showed up, she smiled. She remembered that the man at table 7 liked his bourbon neat and never with ice, and she kept her eyes moving and her opinions to herself. The Velvet Room's owner, a cheerful and carefully neutral man named George, had one unspoken rule for his staff. When certain guests arrived, you treated them well, you didn't linger, and you did not, under any circumstances, make them feel observed. Sloan had figured this out on her third shift when she noticed that one corner booth was always reserved, always slightly better lit than the rest of the room, and always shielded from the front entrance by a low decorative partition that someone had once described to her, unconvincingly, as an aesthetic choice. Salvatore Mancini came in on the first Thursday of every month. She knew him as Mr. Sal. He was a compact, silver-haired man with the deliberate manners of someone who had grown up poor and spent a lifetime learning to move through expensive rooms as though he had always belonged in them. He ordered the same thing every time, a glass of Barolo, a plate of the house charcuterie, and a small bowl of mixed olives that he never finished but always asked for. He tipped in cash. He was unfailingly polite. He was also, Sloan eventually understood, the reason the Velvet Room existed at all. The men who came with him varied. Sometimes there were 2, sometimes 4, stationed at the edges of the room with the particular quality of stillness that Sloan associated with serious athletes and serious threats. On the first Thursday of October there were 3, one near the front entrance, one near the service hallway, one at the bar nursing a glass of sparkling water he never drank. Salvatore was midway through his second glass of Barolo when Sloan came back from the kitchen with a replacement bread plate. She noticed the man before she noticed the gun. He was standing near the partition, close enough that she could see the rainwater still dripping from the hem of his jacket. He was not a regular. He moved with a particular kind of urgency that didn't belong in a room like this, tight and directed. His right shoulder turned at an angle that shielded his hand from the sight line of the guard near the bar. Sloan's brain processed several things at once, in the way that the brain sometimes does when it has no time to be careful. The guard at the bar was looking at his phone. The partition was blocking the guard at the door. The bread plate in her hands was heavy ceramic, and the man in the wet jacket was raising his arm. She didn't make a decision. There wasn't time for one. She threw herself sideways, leading with the bread plate, catching the man's arm at the wrist, with enough force to send his aim wide. The gun discharged, a sharp, suppressed crack, and the bullet punched through the decorative partition and buried itself in the far wall, 2 feet to the left of Salvatore Mancini's head. The second shot found her. It caught her in the right side, just below the ribs. She didn't fall immediately. That was the strangest part. She would think later. In the long hazy hours morphine wore off at the edges, and she had nothing to do but remember. She didn't fall. She staggered back into a table, knocked a glass off the edge, and then her legs simply stopped cooperating. And she went down onto the black and white tile floor, and the cold of it was the last clear sensation she registered before the room tilted sideways, and everything became noise and light, and the distant sound of someone shouting in Italian. The guards converged in seconds. The man in the wet jacket made it 3 steps toward the service hallway before he didn't make it any further. Salvatore Mancini was on his knees on the floor beside her before anyone thought to stop him. "Look at me," he said, pressing his folded pocket square against the wound with both hands, the wool of it immediately useless and dark. "Stay with me, child. Eyes on me." Sloan looked at him. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that his eyes were very dark and very kind, and that he looked genuinely frightened, and she had not expected that. "I'm okay," she said, which was not true, but felt like the right thing to offer. "You are not okay," Salvatore said without any particular gentleness, because he was not a man who found comfort in false things. "But you will be. I promise you that." The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes. It felt much longer. Tulane Medical Center's 7th floor was not typically closed to the public. But on the Friday morning following the incident at the Velvet Room, the entire East Wing had been quietly and efficiently converted into something that functioned less like a hospital floor and more like a fortified waiting room. The staff who worked the floor that day would later describe it in varying terms: a film production, a private event, a security exercise. But none of them were confused about who was responsible for the arrangement or what it meant to push back against it. Dominic Mancini had arrived from Houston at 3:15 a.m. He was 41 years old and carried himself with the particular economy of someone who had learned, early and permanently, that wasted motion was wasted authority. He was not especially tall. He was not the largest man in any room he entered. But there was something about the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved when he walked into a space, cataloging and assessing with no apparent effort, that made people step back without knowing why. He had been running the operational side of the Mancini organization for 6 years, since his father had begun his quiet, unannounced step back from the daily mechanics of the business. He handled logistics, contracts, and consequences. He was very good at all 3. When he arrived at the hospital and saw his father sitting upright in a chair in a private waiting room, unhurt, holding a cup of terrible coffee, Dominic experienced approximately 4 seconds of relief before his mind shifted to the work that needed doing. "Tell me," he said. Salvatore told him. When he finished, Dominic stood very still for a long moment. "Which family?" "Caruso," his father said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "They want the port contracts," they thought. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the eyes that Dominic recognized as his father working through an emotion he considered a private matter. "They thought removing me would destabilize the organization enough to create an opening. They were wrong, obviously." Salvatore set down his coffee. "Dominic, the girl, I know, she had no reason to do what she did. She is a waitress. She is 23 years old. She is not one of ours." His father's voice was level, but underneath it was something that Dominic had heard only a handful of times in his life: a weight, a pressure, the particular quality of a debt, acknowledged by a man who did not take debts lightly. "She put herself between a bullet and my head, and she did it without a moment's hesitation. She did not know who I was, what I was. She simply saw a man about to be shot." Dominic said nothing. "She has a gunshot wound to her right side," his father continued. "The bullet nicked the lower lobe of her lung. She is out of surgery. The doctors say she will recover, but the recovery will be several weeks. She has no family here. A father who died this past January, no siblings, a landlord who will expect rent at the end of the month." Salvatore paused. "And now she is a witness to a murder, which means the Carusos will want her dead." There it was. Dominic had already been thinking it. The moment his father had described what the woman had done, the first thing his mind had done, not the second thing, not after the gratitude, but the very first thing, was map the threat. a civilian witness to a Caruso hit on a Mancini. She had seen the shooter. She had interfered with the operation. In the Caruso family's accounting, she was a loose end, and a loose end connected to the Mancini family, which meant she was his problem. The Commission's law on civilians, Dominic said, is very clear, his father said. A civilian under formal Mancini protection is untouchable. The cost of moving against her would be a violation that would bring the full weight of the Commission down on whichever family did it. He looked at his son steadily. But informal protection, guards, money, a house somewhere, is not the same thing. The Carusos would find a way around it eventually. They are patient. They are patient, and they are methodical, and she is young and she has a long life ahead of her that they will wait to destroy. Dominic turned to the window. The city was gray and wet outside, steam rising from the streets in the early morning heat. There is one protection, his father said, that the Commission cannot argue with, and the Carusos cannot circumvent. Don't. I am not telling you anything you haven't already understood. Dominic was quiet for a long time. She doesn't know us. She doesn't know this world. She took a bullet protecting a stranger, and your solution is to tie her to the most dangerous name in the Gulf Coast. My solution, Salvatore said quietly, is to make sure she lives, which is the least we owe her. He stood, moving slowly in the way that Dominic had been noticing more often the past year, a deliberateness that had nothing to do with dignity and everything to do with not showing pain. How you speak to her, what you offer her, what you tell her about what it means, that is your work, not mine. I raised you to be honest. Start there. He left the room. Dominic stood at the window for another 20 minutes, thinking. Sloan woke up in stages. The first stage was sound, the rhythmic machinery of the monitors, the low hum of climate control, a television somewhere playing a morning news program at low volume. The second stage was the ceiling, white acoustic tile, a fluorescent panel, the kind of aggressively neutral institutional design that said hospital without any ambiguity. The third stage was pain, arriving late but thorough, settling in her right side and radiating outward every time she breathed. She assessed the room before she moved. This was something she had learned from her father, who had been a cautious man in the useful sense of the word. The room was private. It was larger than a standard hospital room. The window had a partial view of the river. There were flowers on the sill, a simple arrangement, white and yellow, which struck her as oddly tasteful for a hospital. And there was a man sitting in the chair beside the door. He was not a nurse. He was in a charcoal jacket, no tie, and he was watching her with the calm, appraising focus of someone who had been waiting for her to wake up for some time. There's water on the table, he said. Don't sit up too fast. She didn't. She took the water, drank carefully, and looked at him. You're his son, she said. Something moved through his expression. Not quite surprise. You have the same eyes. She set the glass down. Is he okay? He's fine. A pause. He's been asking about you since 3 this morning. Sloan processed this. Her side hurt. Her head was slow and thick with whatever they had given her. But her mind was still her own, and it was presenting her with a version of last night that was becoming clearer and more alarming by the second. The man with the gun, she said. Is he? He won't be a problem. She understood what that meant. The people who sent him, she said carefully. They know what I did. Yes, they'll want to make sure I don't describe what I saw to anyone. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. You're not here to offer me flowers and a gift card. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. It did not reach his eyes, but it was genuine, which surprised her. No, he said. I'm here because my father asked me to be honest with you, and because I think you deserve to understand exactly what situation you're in. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice was level and direct, with no softening and no condescension, and she appreciated both of those things more than she expected to. The family that ordered the hit on my father has a long memory and a strong motive to silence anyone connected to what happened last night. I can put guards on you. I can relocate you. I can cover your medical bills and your expenses for the next year. None of that will stop them permanently. They are patient. They will wait until an opportunity presents itself. Sloan looked at the ceiling. She was thinking about her apartment, about the electric bill, about the 18 credits she still needed, and what happened to her enrollments if she was in the hospital for weeks. She was thinking about her father, who had died in a room not entirely different from this one, and how she had sat beside him and held his hand and made promises she was still trying to keep. What will stop them? She asked, though she already had a sense of the shape of the answer. Dominic Mancini was quiet for a moment. Under the codes that govern this world, codes that even rival families are bound by, under penalty of sanction from the Commission, there is one status that is completely, irrevocably protected, not because it's sentimental, because violating it triggers consequences that no family with any operational intelligence would want to absorb. He looked at her directly. The wife of a Mancini is untouchable. Moving against her would be treated as a declaration of war against the Commission itself. The Carusos are aggressive, but they are not suicidal. Sloan was quiet. I am not asking you to pretend this is something it isn't, Dominic continued. I am not offering you a romance. I am offering you a legal fact, a protection that will hold for as long as you need it to hold, backed by the most significant authority that exists in this world. You would have the Mancini name, your debts would be cleared, your nursing degree would be fully funded. You would live in a secured estate in the Garden District, with your own staff and your own space, and complete freedom to continue your life within the parameters that security requires. He paused. In return, I would ask that you present publicly as my wife, and that you tell no one outside of what is necessary, and if I say no, then I put the best security I have on you, and I pray it's enough, he said. I won't force you. That is not on the table. My father would never forgive me, and frankly, I wouldn't forgive myself. Sloan turned her face toward the window. The river was visible past the rooftops, gray-brown and slow in the morning light. She thought about the expression on Salvatore Mancini's face when he had pressed his pocket square against her side, that genuine fear, that weight. She thought about the old man's voice, "You will be, I promise you that." She thought about what it meant that she was already calculating, already measuring this strange, impossible offer against the reality of what waited for her outside this room. The apartment, the bills, the cracked phone, the feeling of lying here, helpless, knowing that somewhere in this city, people were having a conversation about whether she was worth the trouble of killing. She was not, she realized with some clarity, interested in being worth the trouble of killing. I have conditions, she said. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted slightly. Tell me, my nursing degree. I finish it. Whatever this arrangement looks like, I finish my degree, and I sit my boards and I work. Maybe not a public hospital, but I work. Agreed. I want access to a lawyer, my own. Not yours, also agreed, and she stopped. Thought about it. I want to meet your father again, before I sign anything, in person. Something moved through Dominic Mancini's face that she couldn't quite name, a softening, almost like something loosening behind his eyes. He'll be down the hall in about 20 minutes, he said. He's been waiting. The wedding took place 9 days later. It was not a large event. The venue was the Mancini estate in the Garden District, a white columned house behind iron gates and a screen of old magnolias that had been on the property for longer than anyone currently living could verify. The ceremony itself was attended by fewer than 30 people, all of them known to the Mancini family in one way or another, most of them understanding without being told that the occasion called for discretion and not questions. Father Benedetto, who had baptized Dominic Mancini 41 years ago and had been navigating the complicated moral topography of the Mancini family ever since, performed the ceremony in the front parlor. He asked no questions that hadn't been answered to his satisfaction previously and prayed with the particular earnestness of a man who had made his peace with the fact that the Lord's work sometimes took place in unusual rooms. Sloan wore a cream-colored dress that had been selected for her by a woman named Adeline, who worked for the estate and had a gift for elegant practicality. It had a high waist that accommodated the bandaging on her right side without making the accommodation obvious. Her hair was down. She had no bridesmaids, no flowers, and no family in the room, but she stood upright on her own power, which felt that day like its own kind of defiance. Salvatore Mancini sat in a wing chair near the window. He did not look well. The events of that Thursday had taken something from him that hadn't fully returned, but his eyes were alert, and when Sloan caught them before the ceremony began, he nodded at her once. A small grave nod that said, without words, that he understood what she was doing and that he would spend the rest of his life knowing it. She nodded back. When Dominic took her hand during the exchange of rings, his grip was firm and careful. The grip of someone holding something fragile with hands that didn't know how to be gentle but were trying. He slid a ring onto her finger, a simple oval diamond set in platinum, nothing ostentatious, which she appreciated, and said the required words in a voice that was low and even. When it was over, he leaned in close, his lips near her temple, and said quietly, "You're protected now. I keep my promises." She believed him, which surprised her. She was not sure what she had expected him to be. She had expected cold, maybe. Calculated, transactional. Those things were true, in part. He was all of them. But he was also, she was beginning to understand, a man who operated according to a code that he took seriously, and that seriousness had a solidity to it that she found unexpectedly steadying. She was thinking about this, standing with a glass of sparkling water on the estate's rear gallery, while the small gathering dispersed inside, when Adeline appeared at her elbow and said in a low voice that perhaps Sloan should come inside. Sloan looked at her. The woman's expression was composed, the composure of someone managing alarm deliberately. "Now, ideally," Adeline said. Inside in the estate's main study, two of Dominic's men were talking to him in tight, rapid voices. He was standing at his desk with his back to the door, and when Sloan entered, he turned around and looked at her with an expression that she would come to know. The particular blankness that meant his mind was moving fast, and he was choosing not to show it. "Go with Adeline," he said. "There is a room on the 3rd floor prepared for exactly this contingency. Stay there until they come to you." "What's happening?" "There was a security failure this morning that I have just been informed of." His voice was controlled. "It doesn't change anything. The protections are in place. But I need you somewhere secure while I deal with the source, Dominic." He looked at her. "I'm not going to panic," she said. "I'm also not going to pretend I'm not standing right here. So tell me what's happening, and then I'll go with Adeline." He studied her for a moment. The same assessing look she had seen that first morning in the hospital, calculating and direct. Then he said, "One of my men on the outer perimeter made contact with the Caruso family this week. We don't yet know what information passed. We are finding out." He paused. "The estate is secure. Every internal measure is active. But I wanted to inform you before you heard anything secondhand. Is your father in danger?" "My father is in his suite with 4 men outside the door and a stubbornness that I have long since stopped trying to work around. A beat. Something that was almost dry, almost human. He is fine." She nodded. "Okay." She turned to follow Adeline, then stopped. "When you find out what the man told them, I will handle it. I know you will." She looked at him steadily. "I meant, tell me after. I'd rather know." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. "All right," he said. She went with Adeline. What Dominic Mancini dismantled over the following 3 weeks would be spoken of, in the careful, elliptical language that governed such conversations, as a restructuring. The Caruso family's challenge to the port contracts was resolved through channels that the Commission acknowledged and did not publicly address. The man from the perimeter security detail, whose name was a minor detail by the time the story was finished, was not heard from again. The Caruso family, facing a unified response from 3 affiliated organizations and the implicit weight of the Commission's attention, withdrew their claim on the contracts and their interest in Sloan Wilder, who was, by every legal and formal measure, no longer Sloan Wilder at all. She went back to class 7 weeks after the shooting, in a car driven by a man named Carl, who was former Secret Service, and communicated primarily in monosyllables, which suited her fine. She sat in the back of an introduction to clinical practice seminar and took notes on her laptop, and did not tell any of her classmates what she had spent the previous 7 weeks doing. In the evenings, she studied at a desk, in the room she had been given on the 2nd floor of the Garden District estate. Dominic worked late most nights, and she would sometimes hear him pass her door at midnight or 1 in the morning, footsteps measured and even, and then the muffled sound of his office door closing at the end of the hall. One evening in December, she knocked on the door. He was at his desk with a glass of scotch and a spread of papers, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked up when she opened the door with the expression of someone expecting a problem requiring immediate management. "I passed my clinical practicum," she said from the doorway. He set down his pen. "The one you were worried about. The instructor has a reputation for failing students on technicalities. I didn't give him any." She leaned against the doorframe. "I'm officially on track to sit my boards in the spring." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Congratulations," he said, and he meant it. She had learned to distinguish by now between the words he deployed out of social habit and the words that were backed by something real. "I also," she said, "want to say something that I've been trying to work out how to say for about 3 weeks." He waited. "I don't think either of us planned for this to be anything other than what it was described as," Sloan said. "And I'm not asking you to reframe it or pretend it's different than what it is. But I want you to know that I see you, Dominic. Not the organization, not the name. You." She paused. "You have been honest with me every single time, when that was clearly not the easy thing to be. You have treated me like a person with a brain and the right to my own decisions. And I noticed those things." The room was very quiet. Outside, the magnolias were dark shapes against the December sky. Dominic Mancini, who had negotiated across tables with men who would have killed him without a second thought, who had held the fractured pieces of his family's empire together through 3 different crises before the age of 40, who had not, in the 6 years of running the operational backbone of the Mancini organization, allowed anyone access to the unguarded version of himself, looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as careful hope. "I noticed things too," he said. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and they talked, not about the organization, not about security, not about the commission or the Carusos or anything with stakes. Just talked, in the quiet December dark, the kind of talking that is less about the words than about the willingness to stay in the room. It was, she would think later, the moment that something shifted. Salvatore Mancini died peacefully the following March, in his suite on the 2nd floor, with his son on one side of the bed and Sloan on the other. She had been the one to notice the change in his breathing late that evening and wake Dominic at 2 in the morning. Nurse's instinct, newly sharpened by months of clinical training, reading the particular rhythm of a body beginning to let go. Dominic had come immediately, without the suit, without any of the architecture he usually wore, and he had sat beside his father and held his hand with a quietness that was unlike anything she had seen from him before. When it was over, Dominic sat for a long moment with his father's hand still in both of his. Then he looked up at Sloan. She reached across the bed and covered his hands with hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She stayed. In the spring, Sloan Mancini sat her nursing boards. She passed on the first attempt, in the 92nd percentile. The results came through on a Thursday afternoon, and she sat with her phone in her hands, in the car with Carl, who said "nicely done" in such a flat voice that she laughed out loud, which was the best possible response. That evening, Dominic opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for no particular occasion. "To what?" she asked, holding up her glass. He looked at her across the kitchen table. No study, no desk, just the table where they had taken to having dinner on the nights when the world permitted, and said, "To the fact that a 23-year-old waitress in an impossible situation chose to act and changed everything." "I was acting on instinct," she said. "I didn't know what I was doing. The best decisions usually aren't the ones you make deliberately," he said. He was looking at her with that expression again, the careful hope, the unguarded version. "I have been deliberate my entire life. Everything I have done has been calculated and considered and weighed 3 times before I acted on it." He paused. "And then you walked into that hospital room and asked about my father before you asked about yourself, and I realized I had no calculation for that." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to renegotiate anything," he said quietly. "I know what we agreed to and I know why. I'm only telling you that what I feel is not what was on the paperwork." Sloan set down her glass. She thought about 9 months ago, the cold tile floor, the dark of the room going sideways, the terrifying clarity of the old man's eyes. She thought about waking up in that hospital room and choosing not to panic. She thought about 18 credits and a cracked phone and a nursing license with her married name on it. She reached across the table. "Neither is what I feel," she said. He looked down at her hand covering his. When he looked back up, the calculation was gone entirely. In its place was something rarer. A man, not a don, not a name, not a fortress. Simply a man relieved beyond words to have been found. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful, formal kiss at the ceremony. It was a beginning. New Orleans has a long memory, and it loves a story. It loves excess and tragedy, and the strange, improbable moments when someone ordinary turns out to be something else entirely. It would remember, in the vague and partial way that cities remember things, that there was a woman named Sloan who worked a late shift at a room on the east side of Bourbon Street, who did something extraordinary for a stranger, and who ended up, against every expectation, against every logic, exactly where she was supposed to be. She passed 4 more licensing certifications over the next 2 years. She built a practice out of the estate on certain mornings, serving families in the surrounding neighborhood who had no particular interest in who her husband was, or what his name meant, only that she showed up, and she was competent, and she cared. Dominic ran the Mancini organization with the same deliberate efficiency he always had, but the men who worked for him in those years would privately note that he was different. Not softer, exactly, still precise, still formidable, but there was a quality about him, an ease, maybe, in the moments when the work was done and the door to the study was closed, that hadn't been there before. No one who mattered ever came for her again. The name held, as he had promised it would. She kept hers, too, in the way that mattered, the instinct, the directness, the refusal to be managed or softened or made afraid of her own clear-eyed view of the world. She was Sloan Mancini when the occasion required it. She was Sloan Wilder when she needed to remember where she had come from and what she was capable of surviving. She kept up both. They fit. Would you have done what Sloan did? Thrown yourself between a stranger and a bullet with nothing but instinct and a bread plate? Or would the survival math have stopped you in your tracks? Let us know in the comments below, and if you loved this story, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library for a new story every week.